Insurance renewal report for fiscal year 2009. Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director, and we will start with item number 1, which is the Upper State Street Dedicated Transit Lanes Feasibility Study. And for that item, I will turn it over to Browning Allen.
Mr. Allen.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Horton. Browning Allen, Transportation Manager. I have with me Rob Dayton, our Principal Transportation Planner. Last year, Council directed staff to look at doing a study to look at the possibility of doing a dedicated transit lane on Upper State Street. When the Community Development Department brought forward the idea of going forward with design guidelines for the Upper State Street area, the Council asked us to take a look at whether we could and where we would place a dedicated transit lane before they move forward with those design guidelines. So what staff has done from the Transportation Division is we've gone out, we got proposals. We got proposals from 2 firms, one from Perrin Ferris and the other from KOA, to do the analysis, trying to be responsive to the direction from Council. So the proposals came in between $181,000 and $256,000. The firm of Perrin Ferris, they have about $50,000 in reductions that could be made to get the proposal down to $206,000. And at least our initial reaction is to go with Perrin Ferris based on some of the things that they're proposing to do. What we're here to talk to the Finance Committee about is how do we pay for the study. We've taken a look at the Measure D reserve funds, and we have, going into next fiscal year, $355,000 available in the Measure D reserve funds. You know, this afternoon at closed session, we're going to be talking about 319 West Haley. So we're going to have, how do we deal with that property, which might have an impact in terms of if we decide to keep that property, how do we pay for that? So we have some decisions that need to be made in terms of financing and how do we pay for it. You know, I had an opportunity to talk to our new Public Works Director of some of the funding and how we can pay for it. And our biggest concern is taking $206,000 to pay for the study out of reserve funds. Is that the most prudent thing as we get ready to go into our next fiscal year? So maybe probably the best thing would be to do is if the desire of the Finance Committee is to pay for it out of the Measure D versus the general fund, and I wouldn't recommend making adjustments to the Streets Capital Program because we're already on a shoestring in terms of that program, is to sit down with the consultant that we're looking at working with, see if we can refine this proposal or maybe break it down into 2 phases. Phase 1 being, we know we would like to take a look at doing a dedicated transit lane on Upper State Street. How much would it cost to do the analysis on the benefit to transit? Regardless of what type of transit, whether it be bus or maybe a light rail. I think one of our council members had a desire for that be taken a look at. How much would that cost? And could that be phase 1, and phase 2 would be finalizing it. Where would it be? How wide the lanes would be? Would it be through the median, one side of the street, or both sides of the street? So.
Before we, as I understand it, our discussion today is really financing options, and that's really the extent of what is noticed for today. But could you clarify, for those that haven't heard of this before, when we speak of a dedicated transit lane, exactly what does that mean? And are we talking 50 years from now, 6 months from now? Put the thing in a little bit of a picture for folks.
Through the Upper State Street study, one of the things that was identified as a possibility is doing a dedicated transit lane on the Upper State Street corridor. Basically, what that would be is like a bus-only lane, or lane dedicated to transit. Maybe it'd be bus-only lane, or a lane dedicated to, light rail, but it's transit only, dedicated just to the transit. So that's basically what it is. Feasibility in terms of when will we see it? It definitely won't be within the next 6 months. It could be 10, 20, 30 years before we would see, that type of development to take place. Because there's a variety of things that need it. One, we don't have the city funding to do it. So what one of the things that the study would assist us with is how would we go about moving forward with a dedicated transit lane? Would it be something that the city over the time would be assembling funds to do, assembling land, or as the Upper State Street area is redeveloped, do we, as a condition of approval, that they dedicate the property and contribute money towards the development of a transit lane?
So is this more of a planning tool than it is a tool of reality?
It's a planning tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we don't do a study, what happens?
If we don't do a study, then Well, if we don't do a study, then obviously the Community Development Department will go forward with the design guidelines, you know. But one of the things that we won't know is if some council in the future decides they want to do a dedicated transit lane, if it's determined that it needs to be on either side of the roadway and not going down the middle, if the development that's occurred in the future is built right up to the property lines or right of way, then that would preclude us from doing that, or we would be buying property to put the lane in.
In the future, when cars will not be as available, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Yeah. And could this lead from the railway station to the airport at some point?
That's one of the things that we would look at. Airport, you know, there's a good possibility because of going down the Hollister corridor, but obviously we'd have to work with the county of Santa Barbara as well as the city of Goleta. Down to the rail station is something we've talked about. The question is, how do we get there? You know, do we go down State Street
Chapala.
or Chapala, and then we have to get over to underneath the freeway some way. Yeah. You know, there's options available, but it's going to be a planning document. It's going to be a long-term plan. It's not going to be a near-term plan. I don't think Rob or I will be here. Rob might be. I don't think I'll be here when it gets
Nor I.
built.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Pearson?
Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, you and I had spoken, you'd asked me a question earlier today about how much was available in the Measure D fund reserves, and I had said $555,000, which is actually correct as of today. What I had neglected to remember or had forgotten is that the recommended FY09 Measure D budget, which will be before you this evening, includes the programmed use of $200,000 of Measure D reserves in the Measure D fund. So really, even though the balance today is $555,000 available, assuming the budget is adopted as recommended, is really $355,000.
So you were literally right, but not quite.
That's correct.
Okay, got it. Ms. Falcone?
Thank you. Mr. Browning, Mr. Allen, do you have anything else you want to add before you hear comments?
Complete.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much.
This is our new planning, Public Works Director. Push. Yes.
Okay. And as Brownie mentioned, we had a brief opportunity to talk about this this project a bit. From my vantage point, coming in very new to it, the simple elements of it to me seemed like we were trying to get some information to be able to feed into the planning guidelines. So that's a timing issue that I think is important for your consideration. And the notion of being able to try and balance the budget impacts at the beginning of this fiscal year and get some answers to inform that discussion. As Browning mentioned, if we can phase the analysis so we cut to the chase on maybe getting some clearer answers about what type of a transportation corridor could be useful in this area, that would help inform that guideline discussion, and then we could continue at another phase, possibly next fiscal year if we don't have the funds available to continue it this year, and still complete the public outreach portion. So that was the notion of trying to look at maybe a half, roughly speaking, of, or possibly less for this feasibility of the technical side of it in this current fiscal year.
Okay, thanks much. Ms. Falcone?
Well, here are my thoughts, and I appreciate what you've just said with respect to helping to inform the guidelines. But because of this particular process, the guidelines have been put on hold, and the community is experiencing some frustration over that, whether it's gotten to staff or not. It certainly has gotten to those of us who are out there in the community. And the Plan Santa Barbara effort is well underway, and we hope to have that on a very solid, not fast track, but on a consistent and meaningful track to get it finished within the next 18 months, if you will. The Upper State Street guidelines are imperative to that conversation. And they've already been put on hold for over a year because of this notion of at some day in the future, maybe cars will fly. You know, maybe we will have a dedicated transit lane that goes from the train station or the beach to the airport. However, this is a small city with narrow streets. In order to be able to do that, there are half a dozen, maybe large arteries in the entire city that could even accommodate that, unless, of course, you buy property on either side. Now, what Mr. Allen said with respect to if things are built right up to the sidewalk, then you have a problem. However, within the guidelines, there's enough conversation with having to do with setbacks that it's my impression at this point that the community is not interested in having setbacks come right up to the street. And in any event, it is private property. We would have to start buying property anyway, even if it were a bus in the middle of the lane. So I just think that this is an interesting notion that in a perfect world, in a city the size of Salt Lake, where they have a fabulous inner light rail system in a city that could accommodate some sort of mechanism like that, that would be worth our taking time that we would rather not take because we have the Plan Santa Barbara conversation that is happening now. And the reason we did the State Street Guideline, the Upper State Street Guidelines, was specifically because we wanted to put that into the Plan Santa Barbara conversation. So we pulled it out of order, much to the chagrin of a lot of people, including the Community Development Department, because it took their focus away. Now, it's been a year and a half at this point, and any more delay is not anything that I'm interested in. This notion of something in the future is great, and we need to be visionaries and plan for that, but we don't have the money right now. We are in a fiscal crisis. We don't know how bad it's going to get. We don't know where the bottom is. We don't know how long it's going to last. Taking from the general fund for something like this that is sort of a fantasy in the future is not something that I'm prepared to do at all. Taking Measure B funds or even from Measure D reserves, D, all in alphabet soup, taking from Measure D funds I think is a precarious notion at this moment in time because we don't even know if Measure D, which is now Measure A on the November ballot, is going to pass. If we don't have that pass in November, we run out of Measure D money in its entirety in 2010. Now, it seems to me that it would behoove us to at least strengthen our reserves, not deplete our reserves, and make sure that we have money going into the future until we figure something else out. So I'm not willing to go there either. I think that this is a notion that's worth keeping in our heads, and maybe if we really want to do a planning document, we take some money every year and we build a fund for it. We build a fund over the next 5 years or 8 years to study this in earnest down the road when it makes a little more sense. Now, I just don't think that the planning document should be held up any longer. I don't think what we're going to learn from this is going to materially enhance what we do on Upper State Street. I don't think Upper State Street can handle a dedicated transit lane anyway, so that's my fundamental belief, and I'm just not willing. I know at one point in time when this concept was a kernel in its infancy, I voted yes for it. But last time I voted not only no, but no way. And I'm going to vote no, no way this time again. I don't think it's prudent.
Thank you. Ms. Schneider.
Thank you. First off, welcome, Ms. Anderson, our new Public Works Director, and day 2 and right in the midst of transit lane debates. But you knew that coming in, so that's good. I'm not very interested right now in getting into the whole debate about whether or not to do the study, because that's really a full council discussion, and there's been 2 major discussions so far about that went in different directions those 2 different times. I think the purview of this particular meeting here is, should the majority of council decide to move forward with this, how should it be funded? And I certainly agree that general fund money is not the place to go. And the reason why is if the council wishes to move forward with this project, this is really a long-term planning, visionary future goal of the city, sort of like the general plan update is, like other, like the Upper State Street process is. And I mean, I will say I do think the setbacks and the transportation items go hand in hand. That's what started the whole appeal that led to the whole Upper State Street guidelines process to begin with. So general fund dollars don't seem to me the most appropriate source, just because that's more of your basic day-to-day infrastructure, public safety, parks, library, getting the city moving on a regular basis day to day. This is much more visionary long term. So given that we only have two other options, which is streets and Measure D, part of me says I guess I'm leaning towards Measure D, but it's also hard to make a firm decision today because we don't know the answer to the West Haley Street parcel conversation. So maybe that should be part of that conversation, depending what the council wants to do there, because that could go either way. If the council decides to get rid of that property, then that might be additional funds. If it decides to keep it, well, then how are we going to pay for it? So we're sort of a little premature in having this discussion without knowing the answer to that item yet. But having said that, I would suggest that if the council moves forward with this particular study, that it would be the Measure D reserves that we do that. It's not ideal. I think doing something long-term for year to year to year, 5 to 8 years from now, is actually going to curtail the process in terms of setbacks and other issues we want to do on Upper State Street, because again, the two go hand in hand. So if we decide forget about transit lanes on State Street as a council, then that is a whole different scenario. So so that would be my recommendation moving forward.
And so I'll weigh in on it. I pretty much agree with what's been said. I don't think that, again, to define what we're doing today, I think we've been asked as Finance Committee to suggest to council what would be an appropriate source if they want to do it. We're not here today to decide whether to do it or not, but just to decide what would be the best source of the three listed. There may be others that weren't listed, but if we're going to be looking at those, I would not suggest general fund either as chair of the committee. I don't know. Option 3 is reprogramming, and I don't know whether that's feasible or not. I'd have to hear from one of the public works folks to know if that's even possible. I don't know if it's possible. And so reserves, Measure D reserves, would be the way I would go on it for that specific recommendation. One thing that has not been mentioned, and both Ms. Falcone and Schneider mentioned it, that we don't want to delay the Upper State Street, and no one has ever talked to me about, is this going to delay it further, because I don't think anybody is interested in having that happen. If it's something that can be done in line, I see Mr. Casey sitting out there, maybe you could comment on that. I don't think we want to do another 6 months of delay while we wait, but anyway, Paul, what do you say?
Good afternoon, Chair Horton and members of the committee. Right now, the Upper State Design Guidelines are on hold pending the completion of this study, and so the current council direction is to wait until we have the answers from the study about what sort of right-of-way would be needed and what, if any, additional setbacks or any thoughts about future development going forward. And so we're kind of in a holding pattern to return to council upon the completion of this study and then move forward with that at that point.
Transportation folks?
Our plan, if we were to go forward with the study, is to have the study completed by the end of the current calendar year, so by December of this current year. Mm-hmm. In terms of answering your question, Chair Horton, about if we were to go with the programming of our capital program, I don't have the answer to that question right now. I have to sit down with John Wozniak, who is the program manager. I have projects in the transportation division, as well as there's some street projects. We'd have to basically take a look at all the projects and see what's the most prudent way to go about, and maybe taking a little money from several projects or not doing one project. That's something that we would have to take a look at. Is there possibly doing a combination of reserves as well as capital? Possible. I'm not going to recommend we go in that direction yet. We'd have to take a closer look at that. I think probably the best thing for us to do is like you mentioned earlier, is talk to the consultant, see if we can phase this in and answer the basic question about, is there a benefit to transit by putting a dedicated transit lane in, and how much would that cost us? And then how much is it going to cost us to answer the rest of the question? Where do we put it, and how much right of way are we going to need if we're going to do that? So
Okay.
But
So,
so
yeah,
if we
that's
went
right.
in that two cycles, I guess. The 206,000, is that split up further down? And so if we said, if we found out in phase one that it's not feasible, then we can just stop right there. And does that mean that the price tag would be less than what's being shown here at 206,000?
the $206,000 was to answer the entire question.
The
of
entire
council.
question.
Council
So
asked us,
do
where
we have an option then to go back to the bidder and say, we want to do phase one for X amount, and have the option to say stop if we don't like the answer we hear, and then that would then save additional funds if we're, instead of spending the entire 206,000, if we know early on that we're not going to be able to do what because it's not a feasible project.
That's the question we're going to ask the consultant
Okay.
if we can do that.
Well, if we're going to move forward with a recommendation, I would put that in the recommendation, that in order to have, because if the answer is no and we know that quickly, that also speeds up the process for the State Street Design Guidelines and the setback issue. If the answer is no, then we're done. It's less money. If the answer is yes, then again, that's a council decision if we're moving forward with this process anyway. But I think that will help expedite things and be more fiscally prudent.
Ms. Oakley?
Well, not to be picky, but I'm going to be. The order of questions, the threshold question, as I just heard you, Mr. Allen, say, begins with, would transit benefit from a dedicated transit lane? Is that the threshold question? Well, I think the answer is, duh, yes. I mean, okay, so we're going to spend money and find that out. So the answer, the first question that we're asking is, would transit benefit? The likely answer is going to be yes. Now, the second question is, from what I understand you say, is it feasible, i.e., where does it go? So actually, the is it feasible question comes after the question of the analysis of whether or not transit would benefit. Now, I'm sure there's some engineering reason why, you could come up with transit will not benefit from a dedicated transit lane. I don't see that as being the likely outcome, but just maybe clarify for us exactly what are these threshold questions that are being answered, because if I hear Ms. Schneider correctly, the answer she's trying to get to is down the line a bit. It's not the first question.
I think if, oh,
It
Sorry.
has to be more lit.
It has to glow at you, you see.
yellow.
That's
Okay.
right.
I'm sorry. I think one of the issues that we're talking about with a dedicated transit lane is really how it would function. If you have a lane and you're stopping at the routine number of stops that you currently experience on a transit route along that route, the benefit of a dedicated lane is much more minimal. And if it's essentially an express type lane, then it has a different characteristic in terms of how it serves the public transit function. And those are the questions that I think we would attempt to cut to the chase and provide some better information about relative to the cost and the benefit to the transit riders and the transportation system.
But my point here, I think, is, and I think you've sort of framed that a little bit, is that the meat of the tomato of how would it function, where would it go, is the study that we're being asked to fund. So there is no early question. There is no preliminary, is it feasible, because you actually have to do the full analysis to get the answer. So you've just done the study.
A big portion of the study, as I understand the scope, is really to engage the community, talk with the businesses along the street, work with the feasibility for the public side of that as well. That's a more lengthy process, and it involves another level of information, but it doesn't really address the first phase that we're talking about that's more of the technical feasibility of the function of a transit route in this area.
Can I ask Mr. Casey then, won't some of that, in fact, a fair portion of that discussion be had if we can get the guidelines finished, assuming that the community still wants the setbacks? Won't that be a conversation that we're having within the Plan Santa Barbara discussion? Now, I know this is very targeted and very select with respect to, you know, the type of consultant and the type of question. It's very, very narrow and very lasered in. However, aren't some of those larger conversations and questions that are going to be asked, isn't that all part of the Plan Santa Barbara conversation? It's true. It's part of the community may not want light rail down, you know, a mile and a half stretch of State Street, you know.
Mr. Chair and
Mr. Casey.
Committee Member Falcone, I think to some extent the easy way out is that's a policy question. You can do it either way. And I think I'll just recap one more time how we got to where we are now. And that is we had Plan Santa Barbara going forward. We had an appeal and a number of pending projects on Outer State Street. And so we said, whoa, hold on, let's do some focused planning study on Outer State Street first, which we did. And one of the recommendations of that prior to Plan Santa Barbara, and one of the recommendations was to do some urban design guidelines to kind of help facilitate those projects as they come forward and give the Design Review and Planning Commission the tools to look at those projects. And then as we were going to go forward to begin those, which, by the way, we don't have funding for, so when we come back to that, that's a difficult one as well. The question was, whoa, you know, one of the ideas that was talked about was a dedicated transit lane, and we want to make sure we don't do anything development-wise that's going to preclude or further hinder the implementation of a transit lane. So before doing the design guidelines, let's do this analysis and find out, make sure we're not tripping over ourselves and working against cross purposes. And so I think as you kind of follow that path, that's a fine logical path. If you want to stop and have kind of that broader conversation as part of Plan Santa Barbara, I think that's appropriate as well. You then have to have the policy question of do you go forward with the design guidelines or not without having that information, and are the SD2 setbacks, which are in place now, these greater setbacks in the area, is that enough for the interim to kind of preserve enough right-of-way for an ill-defined, unknown transit study, which we can't answer for sure this day without doing the study, but that's another option as well.
Okay, well, we do have another topic today. So we've been asked a specific question, and I think that's all we're supposed to answer today on this one. Is there a motion on this? Ms. Schneider?
Yep. I will move that should the council decide to move forward with the study, that the funding should come from Measure D reserves, and that the proposal itself should be bifurcated into two different parts, one being the technical study ahead of time. That will be less money, and then should the council decide to move forward, to then move forward with the second part of that study.
Okay, so what you're recommending is not to go forward with the study or not, but how the funding would be proposed if the council decides to go forward.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yep.
Is there a second? I'll second that. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
No, for the record. I think
Okay.
0 should be spent.
Next item is an insurance report. I think our insurance staff is here, so let's proceed with that.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director still.
I just wanted to wake everybody up, you know, and get them all going.
Yeah. As you know, I'm going to be joined, there he comes, by Brad Landreth, our risk manager. And just by way of background, you know that all of our insurance policies and coverages renew on a fiscal year basis. And since we are within 3 weeks of the end of the fiscal year, Mr. Landreth is currently working with our insurance underwriters and carriers and joint powers authorities and working on our renewals for next year. And as we have done for the last several years, we wanted to bring to you, prior to the renewals, an indication or an update on what we're seeing out there in the marketplace by way of the renewal costs, availability of coverage, and the like. I will say, as I'm sure Mr. Landreth will reiterate, that these are still preliminary indications. Until we see the invoice appear on Brad's desk, we don't actually have the final word. But we feel pretty confident, based on past experience, that the numbers we're seeing now are probably very representative of what they will end up being. Other than to say that I think we have some good news for you, I'll be glad to turn it over to Brad now, Brad Landreth, and have him take you through it.
Welcome to the committee. I think this may be the first time you've been here this year, at least.
That's correct.
And we're happy to have you here, and any good news is appreciated. I just returned from a nationwide, in fact, international conference, and most people don't have any kind of good news at all in municipalities throughout the nation and in the world. So good news of any sort is appreciated. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Before you is our staff report, and we have two attachments. I'd like to start with attachment 2, if I may, which is a description of all the policies. The Risk Management Division within Finance maintains a commercial insurance portfolio of about 9 policies. And in this policy description, we're starting off with property insurance. The city has close to 400 separate pieces of property that total around $337 million. So we need to insure that property from things like fire and windstorms, including earthquakes and flood. So this property policy includes what they term all risk, as well as earthquake and flood. This year, our indication is that we are going to be paying about $975,000 for that policy. Last year, we paid $1,027,000 for that. So there's going to be a little bit of a cost savings there. And by the way, in attachment 1, which is the finance, it has a comparison of those costs as well. Again, we have different deductibles on the property depending on the locations. You'll note that the Stearns Wharf and Marina have higher deductibles than the other properties, and that's primarily because we've experienced some losses at Stearns Wharf a couple times in my 20-plus year tenure here, and unfortunately, in the particular purchase consortium program that we participate in, and by the way, there's at last count about 4,000 public entities across the nation that participate in this program, and Santa Barbara was one of the first 3 to start the program about 10 years ago, and it's grown massively. And what it does is allows this consortium to go into the insurance market, and we're a big player. Basically, the premium that's generated out of this program is within the Fortune 500 company. So it's very large and very complicated, henceforth why it takes so long for us to get the indications and our invoices. We usually get the invoices somewhere around the last week in June. Having said that, the most losses in this program have been to wharfs, and unfortunately Stearns Wharf is one of those that had sustained some damage. But the good news this year is that that loss that occurred almost a decade ago has fallen off the loss record, so we should be seeing some reductions going forward, I would hope, on the costs of our overall insurance program with respects to property insurance. That's the all-risk portion. The earthquake portion...
Just before you leave that one, Brad, in looking at your deductible here, the wharf is listed as a separate item.
Correct.
Now, is that the only one? I mean, the airport is not listed as a separate item. There's nothing else of that nature?
No, with the exception of flood. And if you notice under the flood, we have 2 different deductibles. And depending on if the property's in a A or V zone, and not to spend too much time on the zones, because there's about 15 different zones. The A and V, the V, I believe, pertains to coastal areas. And, the airport is in a floodplain. And I believe they're in the A floodplain, because as you know, that area used to be an estuary many, many decades ago. So if we had a flood at the airport, likely we would be paying the $250,000 deductible. But keep in mind, these are per occurrences, and the last time we had to file a claim against our flood was, I believe, in the 97 during the El Niños. We only paid one deductible. And we were able to pay the lower of the deductible because we said, we're only going to pay one deductible, and it applies to all our losses. So that's typically how it happens. But if we only had a flood just at the airport, likely as we'd be paying $250,000.
Question, Brad.
Yes.
Two quick questions. One, the $337 million, is that assessed value on property? Is that assessed or is that fair market?
That's done
or
by
replacement. What is
it's
that?
in some cases it's replacement cost, but basically what it includes is real property, personal property, as well as rents. So, for example, when we had the Stearns Wharf fire, if the contracts we had with the renters there did not include a business interruption or rental interruption, then our insurance policy triggered and paid the rents that would be coming in, the revenue that would be coming into the Stearns Wharf. In fact, that did happen to the tune of several $100,000 because, as you know, it took a longer period of time to rebuild that portion than what was required of the renters to pay in their leases.
But a building, is it replacement?
Yes, replacement cost.
Okay.
But, excuse me, Brad, I don't know that, $337 million is a declared value, is it not?
That's correct.
In other words, I don't think we're trying to tell you that in order to replace every facility and building within the city, that we could somehow do that for $337 million.
That is
Cater or El Estero alone would probably be $100 million.
That's exactly the point of the question is,
right,
is
that's
because
what
the public
right.
is going to think 337 is kind of the value of all the buildings and things that we own, and it's not about that.
No, it's about declared values for insurance purposes.
And your premiums are assessed based on that one of many factors, one of which is the values. That
Okay, so in effect, a great deal more is covered through this policy than just meets the eye through that declared value.
Correct.
Yes. The Stearns Wharf replacement, is that you say it's per occurrence, but in the 97 El Niños, we could have had some damage on this storm surge and some damage on that storm surge, but it's all within one season, if you will. It's all within one El Niño event.
If I understand your question, I have to separate it because El Niño, we argue that it was one event, even though it occurred in January and March.
My question is, did they buy that?
And yes, they did.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the shining examples of having this insurance, I'll take you back to that El Niño where we were getting a lot of debris coming from the hillside into the marina area, and that was building up. Yeah, and that debris was building up, and we went in and argued that if the insurance company doesn't pay to dredge that marina, then you're going to have wave wash, which is going to be additional damage. And that argument was successful, and they came in and paid several $100,000 to remove all of that debris. So there's more than meets the eye in this insurance, this program that the city maintains.
Further questions? Okay, please proceed.
We also include a policy moving on to boiler machinery. We do have machinery out at Cater and El Estero that are protected by this. The third policy we have here is a marine liability. We have vessels that are used for harbor patrol, that are used for maintenance in the waterfront, and we also have a couple vessels up at Gibraltar Dam. And what we're paying for here is for what they call protection and indemnity, and for protection and indemnity is third-party liability, and then also for hull insurance, which is property damage. We also maintain a airport liability policy. Under our risk-sharing pool, Excel excludes airport liability, so we purchase a separate policy for that. And it's mainly for operations. We don't own any aircraft, so it's mainly for operations. And I've always used the example of the primary reason for having this is we have a large tarmac out there, and what we want to do is protect a third party from saying that our tarmac or the condition of our tarmac led to some sort of injury or damage, i.e. An aircraft type of incident. I read recently, within the past 6 months or so, that there was an airport in the state of Washington that decided to go on the cheap and paint on the tarmac using regular paint, and you can't use that. You have to use a specialty type of paint. And what happened was the paint deteriorated and got caught into the engines of the aircraft, and the aircraft had to be the aircraft engines had to be cleaned and replaced, and it was multi-millions of dollars that that were claimed against this particular airport agency. So you never know what's going to happen out there, and for the price of $36,000, it's a reasonable price to pay for a multi-million-dollar type of lawsuit that could occur. We also maintain a performance bond. Basically, this performance bond pays for a failure of any employee that handles money. By state law, the city treasurer and the finance director are mandatory to be bonded. This bond, however, covers all employees that handle city money. We also maintain a workers' compensation policy. Now, this is in excess. This is an excess policy. We have a deductible of $750,000, so we're on the first $750,000 is on the city's tab. We have a comprehensive risk workers' comp program to protect that $750,000, and I'm sure you've seen and heard Mark Howard's reports in the past about the workers' compensation program. And this program is through CSAC, which you may recall is the California County State Association. So they have a purchasing consortium that we participate in as well. Our general and automobile liability insurance policy is through Excel. Excel is a joint powers authority. Santa Barbara was an original member to this authority. It now consists of about 11 cities, similar sized cities. And we basically share risk. The first $1 million is a deductible. Then the pool, these 11 cities, share the next $4 million, and then we buy excess above that. And the dollar that we've quoted here is actually an estimate. We're still marketing the excess insurance to this pool, and we'll have a better indication later in the month.
Question
yes.
on this one before you proceed.
Mm-hmm.
So California has 300 cities?
Mm-hmm.
400? Why are we in a pool with 11 instead of 400?
In the state of California, there's probably about 30 different pools, and they range in complexity. Our pool was started before any of these other pools were started, and we decided that we wanted a pool with similar types of cities, and then we created a criteria. You had to have a full-time risk manager, you had to have a comprehensive risk management program, and you needed to fit the other members that wanted to join the pool. So we started this pool in 1986. Most of the other pools, there are a few older pools, but most of the pools were created around that time. And we're a medium-sized city. The pools that have 40 and 50 members are cities that are very small with 5 to 10, 15, 20,000 population.
If I might, Mr. Chair, Bob Pearson again, and I'll say this somewhat flippantly, but it's also true, which is that I don't think there are more than a handful of cities in this state with whom we would want to share risk, because this is a risk-sharing pool. So if another city incurs a loss of $5 million, they're paying the first $1 million themselves, but the rest of the pool is then sharing in the next $4 million of loss, and that's why we have such restrictions in place requiring that they have a full-time risk manager, every member, that they have an adopted and effective risk management program. So when you share risk with somebody, you want to make sure that they have the same commitment to safety and to good practices that you do, and we know that that's not always the case. So
Can you, Brad, name me a few of the cities that are in there? If not, get it to me later.
Yes, I can. They are the city of Anaheim, Burbank, Monterey, Santa Monica, Modesto, Visalia, Bakersfield, and I know I'm forgetting one of them. Santa Cruz is in there, yes. I'm sorry, I did have a list, but here we are. Modesto, Visalia, Santa Monica, Santa Barbara, Bakersfield, Palo Alto, Ontario, Anaheim, Gardena. They're no longer in the pool. Burbank and Monterey.
Thanks. Proceed.
The second to last policy we maintain is a notary bond. We have a number of individuals who function as notaries for the city. We have legal documents that have to be signed from time to time. And so a number of years ago, we decided to go ahead and cover them with a blanket policy, which they are required to have in order to keep their commission. The last policy is a volunteer accident medical plan. And as you well know, we use a lot of volunteers, and we felt it was incumbent upon us to be able to pay for any medical bills that might occur while they are volunteering on behalf of the city. So we purchased this this policy to pay up to $25,000 for any medical treatment they may need in the result of an accident while they're working with the city. We do not provide workers' compensation for volunteers. Moving on to attachment 1, what we provided you here with is a 5-year history, and it's a rolling 5 years, and comparing fiscal year 08 to what we believe is going to occur in 09. We're looking at some cost savings. Now, right now, because these are indications, and as I mentioned previously, the Excel number is an estimate. Basically, I would characterize year over year as being relatively flat. One of the things. Okay. The good news comes in terms of what we budgeted versus what we have been received quoted, and that's the year over year. The second item. This chart shows what we paid in 08, what were quoted in 09, and more importantly, what we budgeted in 09 versus the quote. And in the property, we had budgeted $1.62 million, which is the same number we budgeted in 07. And keep in mind that this is a number that goes back more than 24 months ago. And our recent indication is $975,000. So we're looking at hopefully a cost savings of about $187,000. And short of walking you through each individual one of these, we're looking at a little bit of a cost savings on most of our policies across the board for roughly about $296,000 cost savings year over year. The last
Question for you, Brad.
Sure.
Sorry.
Either for Brad or for Bob. So does those savings go back to, proportionally back to all the different departments? I mean, is that what happens? It's like the rebate we were talking about earlier with workers'
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, that's what staff is proposing once we see the final numbers on the renewal, is that we would simply adjust downwards at a staff level, administratively, the premium charges to the various funds and departments to reflect these lower costs.
And so that savings is not in the current budget proposal we have because we haven't received the final invoice yet? Or?
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
And as Mr. Landreth mentioned, we had essentially 2 years ago when we or a year and so plus ago when we prepared the 2-year financial plan for the second year, based on the trends we were seeing at that time, we projected a 15% rate increase from year 1, 08 to year 2, 09. And as Brad mentioned, we're essentially flat. So we're essentially realizing 15% savings to budget.
That is good news.
And the rebates that we've talked about as part of the budget process really arose out of our workers' comp self-insurance portion. Mr. Landreth mentioned we're self-insured for the first $750,000 per claim. That's the savings that we factored into the budget. So this is actually in addition to that. And
in addition to that is when we get our actuarials again with the workers' comp, there might be further.
It's possible that that's
but,
correct.
But we already raised it recently in order at the last finance committee meeting.
Right.
But that's good. I mean,
Yeah.
that we'll take it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Brad.
And as a side note, we'll be doing a new actuarial study, and hopefully that will be available by October 1. The last table is a cost comparison between the all-risk and the earthquake. Staff has been busting this out for a number of years because the cost of earthquake is significant on a percentage basis, and so we thought it was important to break that out to show you, the cost of earthquake insurance. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Mr. Pearson, any final
Just
comments?
one more comment, Mr. Chair and committee members. We've been showing you this breakout because in the past couple years, as the cost of the earthquake insurance had trended upward and had become, there was a time where, and I know Brad remembers, where the all risk was more expensive than the earthquake. The earthquake was almost a throw-in. And now it's flip-flopped, and so we had discussions the last couple of years with Finance Committee members saying that if the earthquake coverage continued to escalate in cost, that we might want to return to the Finance Committee and have a discussion about whether or not to consider dropping the earthquake insurance altogether. I think happily staff doesn't feel that discussion is necessary at this point, as the earthquake insurance, as you can see, appears to be having dropped from an actual of $850,000 in 2007, and now down, it looks like, to about $682,000 for next year. So, for the time being, staff is content to recommend continuing the earthquake coverage.
Okay. You wanted us to just receive this report today. Do you wish any action from the committee?
No, Mr. Chair, committee members, I don't think so, unless you have some direction for us.
Ms. Schneider?
Just a comment, just to say I appreciate the approach you're taking. It's always easier to get back money into the various accounts as opposed to the other way around, where you're trying to save money up front and then find that things cost more than what you expect, and then you have to find the money somewhere. So, $296,000, if that's what it ends up being, one argument could be, well, we could have used that for something, but we don't know until we actually get the invoice. So I think this is a smart way to do it so being very fiscally prudent, and I appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much.
Good report. Appreciate always as you come and make this presentation to us. Mr. Pearson, any other action items for the committee today?
No, sir, that's it for today.
If not, we'll adjourn our meeting.